Good day everyone. Welcome to the course on next generation sequencing technology, data analysis and applications. In the last few classes, we have been discussing mapping algorithms and in the last class, we talked about Barrows-Wheeler transform based algorithm. So, we have seen how we do the Barrows-Wheeler transform and what are the properties of the transform, namely last first mapping. So, what we are going to discuss today would be read mapping using that Barrows-Wheeler transform based method. Okay. So, that is the agenda for today's class. We will be looking at the process of mapping reads with these BWT based methods. So, these are the keywords that we will come across in today's class. LF mapping, we have introduced this term before. FM index, this is a new term that will come will explain in this presentation, and backtracking. So, just to summarize what we have learned regarding Barrows-Wheeler transform. So, this is a string rotation coupled with lexicographical sorting of a reference sequence, and this gives rise to the Barrows-Wheeler transform. We have seen this, we start with the reference sequence, we add this dollar sign, we rotate the strings, and then we do the sorting, and finally, the last column of that matrix gives us the BWT. So, what we have also seen, because this is just one column, so BWT is of the same size as the genome sequence. So, that is great. So, which means it will not take too much space. Okay. Compare this to the other methods, for example, hash table or suffix array or suffix tree, where a sequence, a reference sequence is probably repeated multiple times, right. We have to store this same base multiple times in the memory. So, that takes a lot of space or storage, right. So, you have seen that if we talk about numbers, then the hash table takes about 12 to 15 GB for human genome. For suffix tree, it is even higher, it is between 30 to 35 GB, whereas for suffix array it is lower, again it is 12 to 15 GB, but still those numbers are quite high if you want to run this on a desktop system, on a simple desktop system, right. So, hopefully, this will not take too much space, and we have also talked about once we have created this Barrows-Wheeler transformation, we can do something called last first mapping. So, this is something we have talked about in the last class, and this allows us to recreate the reference sequence from the BWT and then using the principle of LF mapping. So, once we have understood this Barrows-Wheeler transform method and last first mapping, the question is how do you utilize this BWT and LF mapping to map reads to the reference sequence, right. So, that is the ultimate goal of all the methods, all the algorithms that we have been describing. So, before we go there, I will just quickly mention one point. If you look carefully, you will see BWT actually shares similarity with suffix array. So, let us take the same example of this reference sequence that we have discussed in the last class. So, this is the reference, we go through the whole process that we have just mentioned and discussed in the last class, and we generate this matrix, right, and this BWT is the last column, we have the position here. Okay. So, once we have this, what you can probably notice also very carefully, if you look at this matrix, okay, and if you first focus on these first two rows only, okay, and up to this dollar sign, okay, what you would see is that these are actually the suffixes of the reference string, right. So, if we add this dollar at the end of the reference string and then we start creating all the suffixes, you will see these are the suffixes that we will get. Okay. And if we extend this process, right, for the full matrix and just focus on these letters up to dollar sign for each row, this will actually give you all the suffixes, all possible suffixes of the reference sequence. Okay. So, what is also very interesting is that these are all lexicographically sorted, right. So, you remember when you store the suffix array, we actually do the lexicographical sorting. So, here Barrows-Wheeler transform it will require this lexicographical sorting, and this automatically gives you this suffix array, right. So, along with the positions you get all the suffixes, right, and we can actually write it in a slightly different way, right. Here you see, right. So, once we have done this, once we have written it like this, you can see, right, this actually resembles the suffix array exactly like that, right, and this is all sorted with, and also the positions are here. Okay. So, this kind of tells us perhaps we can go ahead with similar strategy as searching suffix array, right. So, we talked about, because you have this lexicographical sorting, you can do a very efficient search through the matrix or through the string using something called binary search, right. So, the answer is actually no. So, if you are looking for a read sequence using this suffix array method, you cannot perhaps use the same strategy as in the suffix array, right. Why is that so? Because we do not. So, suffix array representation requires storing the whole matrix, right, or at least up to the dollar sign, right. But if you remember, in Barrows-Wheeler transform, we do not store the matrix, right. So, storing the matrix will defeat our purpose of saving space, right. So, if you store the matrix, it will take up too much space, but we do not want that. So, what we store is the last column, right, and we can recreate the first column out of the last column, right. So, this is the maximum data that we store. So, we cannot use suffix array method, right. We cannot use a binary search because we do not store the full matrix that is generated in this Barrows-Wheeler transform. Okay. So, we need to think about alternative strategies, right, and this we cannot, if you go with suffix array, then of course, it will defeat the purpose, right. We will require again a lot of storage. Again, suffix array has a problem, right. You cannot map reads with mismatches, etc., right. So, we will suffer from the same problem if we just go ahead with this suffix array search method. So, how do you search actually? So, the question is, can we use this LF mapping to actually align a read to the reference sequence? Okay. So, we will see like if we can do that, right. So, first let us discuss what is actually stored in this Barrows-Wheeler transform. After we have done the transform, how is the data stored, right, and what are the values that are stored. Okay. So, there is a concept, right. Once you have done this Barrows-Wheeler transform for a string, there is a concept called FM index that actually defines whatever the data that would be stored when you do this Barrows-Wheeler transform, right. So, as you can probably imagine, right, we can use Barrows-Wheeler transform to actually do string matching, pattern search, etc., beyond this just read mapping, right. So, actually those are the original applications, and we have adapted this to read mapping. Okay. So, this FM index, this is an index that contains the Barrows-Wheeler transform along with some small additional data structure, right. So, we will see what are those additional ones, at least some of those we will discuss. The full form is full text minus space, right, and this was proposed by Ferragina and Mangini. So, in 2000 they proposed this index. So, what we store is BWT, the transform that we have done, right, and we can also see that if you want to store the first column, right, you can generate the the first column from the BWT, but in case you want to store the first column, you can actually simply store them as numbers of letters of each type, right. So, let us look at this, right, how it actually looks like, what do we mean actually, right. So, if you look at this full matrix again, right, you have the first column and the last column, and the letters in between, they are never stored, right. So, these are just shown for our understanding. Okay. So, if you see the first column, right, you have these letters A, C, G, T, these are lexicographically sorted. So, what we can do, we can simply store these as numbers of A's, numbers of C's, numbers of G's, and numbers of T, right. So, you have 4 A's, right, and then followed by 3 C's, then you have 3 G's and 2 T's. Okay. So, you can simply say like you can count this, how many A's you have, how many C's you have, how many G's you have, and how many T's you have, and then you can simply store this as 4332, right. You do not even need to store ACGT, because we know we will have these 4 letters, right. So, if you have this 4332, we can immediately derive, okay, we have 4 A's, we have 3 C's, we have 3 G's, and we have 2 T's, right. So, if we can come up with this is very efficient, right, storing just 4 numbers, right. So, whatever those numbers are, right, you do not need to store all these letters, etc., how they appear. Okay. You can recreate this first column very easily if you just have this 4332 or something like that, right. So, we can look at another example, right, for better understanding. So, we have, let us say we are given this 3 4 2 3, that is how the first column is stored, and the assumption is we have this A, C, G, T, these are sorted, right, lexicographically, and we can recreate the first column from these numbers. Okay. So, what it means, we have 3 A's, we have 4 C's, we have 2 G's and 3 T's. Okay. And we can simply write starting with dollar, we can write these 3 A's, 4 C's, 2 G's and 3 T's, right. So, you can see like this is a very easy way to store data, and then you can generate the first column if we know these numbers very easily. Okay. So, how do you now search a read position with this FM index, right, that index that is there, that has been created. Okay. So, what you have, again let us go back to this BWT along with the position, right, and you have the first column, right. First column will be created from those numbers or from BWT, and we can probably apply LF mapping principle to actually find this read out, right, map this read, and we will take this example. For example, we want to map this read TAC, right, we want to find location of this read in the reference sequence, okay, using the information, these indexes that we have created. Okay. So, what are the steps? So, this actually happens in these 3 steps, right. So, we start with the last letter. Okay. So, this happens in reverse. So, if you remember, like we are doing this for suffix tree, we start with the first letter and then go on, right. Here it is actually the other way, right, we start with the last letter. Okay. So, in here in this example with TAC, we will start with C. Okay. So, we start first to look for C and then A, then T. Okay. So, it happens in reverse, and there is a reason we will see like why that actually works, and then we use 2 pointers to find range of matches. Okay. So, there are 2 pointers, we will show them by arrows in the example, next example, and these 2 pointers actually kind of narrows down the range where the match might occur. Okay. So, when you start, they are kind of taking the full matrix, right, and then as you go along, right, they will narrow down to certain choices based on the matches with the letters in the read, right. So, this is how the whole process will work, and this will finally give you the it will converge, right, to probably one row or maybe 2-3 rows if there are multiple matches. Okay. So, let us have a look, right, how this actually is done, right. As I have mentioned, so we start with C here, right. So, if you look at the initial state, these 2 arrows, these are the pointers, right. So, they are pointing to the first column and the last column, last row, sorry, right. So, you have this first row, last row. So, they are taking the full data, right, full data, all the rows are there. Now, what would be the purpose of the next step is actually to narrow down, right. So, what we see is C there, right, the letter C happens, right, and then the pointers now kind of reduce the choice, right. So, it narrows down to the exact matches, right. So, it finds okay, only these rows they start with C, right. So, you have C here. So, these 2 pointers they kind of can exclude the rest of the rows now. Okay. So, we can simply focus on these rows, right. So, they start with C, which means we have found our first match for the first space, right. Now, what we will use now is we will remember the string rotation, okay, that we have done to generate this Parallel transform, and as we have discussed before. So, string rotation means the letters in the last column, right, corresponding to these letters, they represent the letter that occur before this letter in the original string, right. So, let us take an example which will be clear, right. So, if you see here that this is C and the corresponding letter in the last column is T, right. So, what it means is that in the reference string this T comes before this C, okay, because of the string rotations. Okay. So, similarly, if you look at these other 2 rows here, right. So, you have C and then you have A3 here, C2 and A3. What it means is that this A3, right, this occurs before C in the original string, in the reference string. Okay. So, we will remember that, right. So, what we can then now say, okay, we are searching for A. Okay. So, only these 2 C2 and C3 we have A before C's. Okay. right. So, what this would mean is that we are narrowing down our choices further, right. We are kind of narrowing down to choices where we see A before C, right. So, because in the read we have A before C, and we narrow down our choices to those rows where we see A occurring before C, right. All right. So, this is the next step. Again, once we have done this, we will use the principle of last first mapping, right. So, that is why I have written them as this A1, A2, A3, etc. So, that we can easily map them back to the first column, right. So, now we will use the LF mapping, right, and these A3, A4 they correspond to A3, A4 here. So, this is in the first column. Okay. What is the next step? The next step is again search for T, right. So, look for the letters that occur before these A's, right, before A3 and A4. What is the letter that occur before A3 is G1, right, but G is not the match, right. So, we want to find T. What about A4, right. So, A4 we have the letter T1. So, T before this A, which means we have now narrowed it down to the single choice, right. We have just one choice, we have completed the mapping and we have found the read in the reference data, right. So, what you have seen now is we go through this last first mapping, right, and also we remember the string rotation in our mind. Okay. So, once we have this, once we combine those two ideas, we can map these reads very, very easily. And of course, since we have the positions along with this BWT, we know the location of this read in the reference sequence. Okay. So, here is the reference sequence for your information, right. As you can see, it occurs in the 5th position, right. So, if you start counting from 1 to 1, right, here G is 1, then this read occurs in the 5th position of this reference sequence. Okay. So, let us take another example which I think would illustrate this in a better way, right. So, we again start with these pointers that are pointing to the first row and the last row, right. So, we want to find this read SCG in the reference data. Okay. We start, right, we have discussed what we do. So, we start with the last letter which is G here, okay, and we narrow down our choices, right. So, again the pointers move, so it is kind of finding G's only in these positions. So, the narrow you have like a smaller choice now, right, only 3 rows that will be considered. So, that we have found these first 3 first base, right. So, we have found G. Now, we use this again remember the rotation, right. So, we want to see what is the letter that occurs before this G. Okay. So, what we observe here, right. So, for G2 it is C2 occurs before G2, right. So, there is a C, and for G3 there is a C also, right. So, both of these choices are valid, right, because we have found the second letter C in both these choices. Okay. So, what we will have to do now, we will have to continue our last first mapping, right. So, we are in the last column. So, we will again map back to the first column. So, which means this will correspond to this C2 and C3 in the first column, right. What is the next step? We want to find A, right, and what we do again look for the letter that occurs before this C2 and C3 and see which one would actually match this A, whether there is any A at all, right. So, what we do is we look at the rotation, right, we keep the rotation in mind again, and we see both C2 and C3 they actually give A before this C, right. So, you have A occurring before this C in both cases, right. So, both C2 C3 have A and in front of them, right. So, they will be matches. Okay. So, now what it means is that we have found 2 positions in the reference sequence that actually match the read. Okay. So, this is again a read mapping to repetitive sequences, right, and this can happen as we have mentioned, for example, human genome it contains a lot of repeats. So, this will be a quite a frequent occurrence, right. So, what you have seen, there was no issue at all finding the repetitive sequences, right. So, it just tracked all the paths using again LF mapping and keeping the rotation in mind, it found all the maps very, very easily, right. It did not take much time, etc. It just have to find these paths and keep the locations. Okay. So, I hope this clears up the concept of mapping read positions with this FM index, the data that is stored, and as you can see we do not read the whole matrix data, right. So, we do not need to store the full matrix data, just the last column and first column in a very compact form can give us this mapping and very efficiently, right. So, this is a very quick process, as you can see. You do not have to again go through a lot of elaborate steps, right. All right. So, let us take another example, and that will probably help us understand how do we actually traverse through mismatches. Okay. So, here is the read ATC. We follow the same steps, right. We start with these 2 pointers. We start with the last letter C. We have narrowed down our choices. These 3 C's there, right, and we see what is the letter occurring before each of these C's, right. So, what do we observe? So, we have T before C, right. So, this matches the second letter in the read, right. So, you can see here, right, T C, we have found T C. Then we use last first mapping, right. So, here is the last first mapping, and we found T 2, and what we see is G occurs before this T, right. So, but there is no G in our read, right. So, the pointers are lost immediately if there is no exact match. Okay. So, this is again could be a problem, right. So, how do you solve this? How do you actually work around this problem, right. So, what we have seen, if you have perfect match, right, if a read matches perfectly with your reference data, it can find that location very efficiently and very quickly, right. There is no issue, but if there is mismatch, again the pointers will be lost, right. So, what do you do in that case? So, this is the question that we are left with now, is how do you search reads with mismatches using this FM index, right. Can you do something? And it turns out that you can actually, and this method is called backtracking. Okay. And it allows for mismatches, right, and you can also set a mismatch threshold, right, how many mismatches you would allow, right, in your mapping process. Okay. All right. So, let us look at this example now, slightly bigger read GAAC, right, using the same first column and same BWT. Okay. So, you have now learned this process very well, right. So, we have 3 C's, and we look at the letter that occurs before C's, right. So, we have A's, and there are 2 matches now, and we use last first mapping. The pointers, you can see the pointers now moving, right, and we have this A3 A4, right, in the first column, and then we look for the letter that occurs before these A's, right, and what we find is G or T, but in the read we do not have any G or T, right, we have A. So, what this backtracking does, it allows for these mismatches. It says, okay, if you do not find any exact match, let us go ahead with whatever the options that we have. Okay. So, the options are G and T. Okay. So, what it will do, it will just follow, it will allow this G and T, right. So, it will not kind of stop the process, it will say, okay, let us allow G and T, right. So, we will allow G and T, right, and we will continue the alignment, right. So, what will happen now, again the last first mapping. So, we see G1 here and T1 mapping to the first column, right, and we continue this process, and we see this T1, right, the letter before this is G, right. So, this G again matches with the letter in the read. So, what we have found, instead of this GAAC, we have actually found this GTAC, right. So, if you allow for these mismatches, if you allow for this backtracking, it will actually find some mapping somewhere, right, and here it found, right, that we have GTAC, right, that is the best match we have, but there is one mismatch, right. So, one of the issues that you can have if you have a lot of if you allow a lot of flexibility, right, if you allow backtracking, what can happen is that it will probably take all possible options in all steps, right. So, you can see this, right, in this graph, right, in this process, right. If you allow these mismatches, the program may not stop, right, anywhere, right. It might allow a lot of these mismatches, and you may end up with excessive backtracking, right. Excessive mismatch tracking means you have to track through a lot of these paths, right. So, to prevent that, right, there are ways to prevent this, and it is called double indexing. So, there is this index that is created from the forward sequence. So, it is called forward index, and then you have indexing from the backwards side, right. So, it is not a reverse complement, it is a reverse index. So, you will see backward index also, right. And then there are other issues here, right. So, how do you actually store? So, as I said, like we store this BWT, right, the last column, right, we have these letters. How do you store the rank of these letters, right. So, we need to know this A1, A2, C1, C2, right, to do the LF mapping, right. So, how do you store the rank of these letters in the last column, right. If you want to store them like just by store everything, right, imagine for a human genome, right, it will take up a lot of memory, right. And if you are storing this BWT in the hard drive, right, it will also end up taking a lot of storage and it will make the whole process a lot slower, right. So, what we can do is perhaps we can store only at certain positions, right. So, if what I am talking about is these numbers 1, 2, right, which one is the first day, which one is the second day, which one is the third day, right, you need to keep track of that information for doing the last first mapping, right. So, if you have to store that, right, how can we store that without storing everything, right. And what some programs have come up with is that just store only certain locations, right. So, the store information only for certain locations, these ranks, okay. So, instead of storing for all positions, maybe store this information every 5 bases or 10 bases, right. There could, you can vary this, right, and that will reduce the storage requirement a lot, right. So, this is what is done and this is called checkpoints, okay. So, these checkpoints are the points or the locations where these counts are stored, right, the ranks are stored for these letters, right, A, C, T and G. So, if you are for example mapping, right, in this in this kind of situation, if you are mapping and you want to find the rank of a, let us say, one letter, you will not find that rank of that letter stored. So, what you can do, you can go to the nearest checkpoint, right, and see what is the rank of that checkpoint, and then you can deduce the rank of that position, okay. So, in that way you reduce the memory requirement or the storage requirement, okay. So, what are the advantages of BWT based mapping? So, we have learned how we actually can map reads and the reads that match perfectly as well as reads that contain mismatches. So, what are the advantages? So, what we have seen is this is a very fast process, right. You do not have a really complex steps, etc., or time consuming steps. So, this is a very fast process. The memory or storage required is very much less compared to other methods that we have discussed so far. Okay. So, in comparison, this method takes about 1.5 GB, less than 1.5 GB for human genome. So, considering all FM index, double index, checkpoints, etc., you can work with only 1.5 GB of memory or RAM, right. So, it means now it is possible to run it in your desktop computer, right. And we have seen if you allow for backtracking, right, you can map reads with mismatches, right, and these mismatches could be mutations or sequencing errors, right. So, you want to keep them, you do not want to discard these reads, and you can also set thresholds for how many mismatches you would allow in your mapping process. And we have also seen, right, if you have reads that map to multiple positions or repeat sequences, this method actually can handle them without any problem, right. So, it will find all those positions and it will report these multiple positions in the final results. So, here are the references that we have discussed in this presentation. So, to finally conclude, we have defined something called FM index, which can store all necessary data and in a very efficient manner. We have seen that the memory requirement for this process for storing this FM index, right, is actually much lower than the other methods that we have discussed, for example, hash table or the suffix array based methods, right. So, suffix array and hash table, they take about 12 to 15 GB of memory for storing human data, right. Here you can get away with only 1.5 GB, right. So, it is almost 10 times less, right. So, that means you can now run this mapping on your desktop computer quite easily. Okay. So, what we have also seen, right. So, if you use this FM index and the principle of LF mapping, we can map reads very quickly, right, without any problem, and we can also map reads containing mismatches by using a method called backtracking, right. So, combined together, this seems to be and the ideal method, right. So, before we started discussion on biological transform, we started with a wish list, right. So, we wanted a method that does not take too much memory, a method that is fast, a method that can handle reads with mismatches, a method that can map reads to repeat sequences, right. So, it seems like this method has ticked all the boxes, right. So, that is why this is the method of choice, and for most of this most of the mapping that we do in GIS data sets, we use this method most of the time. And there we have it. Thank you.